Okay, so welcome to everybody to our last and third session of Munch on this evening. I am very happy to have Jay Fuhrer with us this evening. Jay is going to be talking about carbon and moving the carbon dial. So I'm excited about this topic. Just to go over a couple of things, we do have some upcoming events coming up. June 21st is the summer tour that will be hosted here north of Beach at our place. And then on July 18th is the Leopold tour at Glen Ullin at the Lance and Anissa Gartner Ranch. So put June 21st and July 18th on your calendars. There is also, for those of you that will be close to Morton County, the Morton County 319 and Soil Conservation District, I believe, is hosting one of our road shows with us, which I don't remember the name of the place, but it's going to be held in Glen Ullin. We'll have some mentors there on a panel, a few other topics. So more details will be shared on the website and Facebook page too. So be looking for that. I would encourage any of you that are not mentor or are not members of the Grazing Lands Coalition to check out our website. We're actually in the process of getting a new website, so I'm kind of excited to see that once it's all done. And I think without further ado, Jay, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to mute myself. So thank you for being on.
You're welcome, Trish. Okay, well, good evening, everyone. It's we're a smaller group this evening, so I hope we can have a little bit of interaction and a little bit of conversation. And so we'll see how this plays out here. I'm just going to see if I can find my way here. Let's see. Trish, did you allow me to share?
Yes, you are listed as a co-host. So if you go down to the bottom, does it show you a share screen?
Not yet.
Okay, let's try. Let me look here one more time and see if there is.
See if we can
remove. Well, it's saying you're co-host, so
okay.
Let me undo it once.
Okay. No, I think I found her.
Okay, good.
I think I found it actually means I stumbled across it. So okay. All right.
There, we're starting to get something to come up.
Okay, I'm going to try to go into view screen here. How are we looking now?
Great.
Okay, so I've got the recording dialog box is still, okay, I got it. So I think we're maybe looking okay, Trish?
Yep, I can hear you good, and I can see your presentation, so.
Okay, well, appreciate that. Well, good evening, everyone, and appreciate the invite to participate with Munch on this with the North Dakota Grazing Lands Coalition. And I'm a strong supporter of our grasslands and the coalition in general. And so it's kind of a treat to talk to everyone this evening. If you have a question, I've tried to reserve some time at the end, but I don't have any objection to somebody jumping on at any time either. And so we can see where we're going to go with that. So what moves the carbon dial? So we'll just do a little bit of brief intro on carbon and soil organic matter. And then from there, we're going to have a few different scenarios that have actually moved the dial on a period of time over about 11-year period of time at the Minokan farm. So we had detailed work in 2009 and then detailed work again soils work done again in 20. And so consequently, that's a pretty good period of time, and it gives you some pretty good information over that period of time. So with that, what moves the carbon dial? And so we're just going to jump right into soil organic matter. And as I mentioned, we started in 09, did the follow-up in 20. So we're going to use that as our foundation information this evening. And I think that's a pretty strong reference of data right there. The interesting thing was we had a lot of same people, because it was a combination of soil scientists from ARS and NRCS and SCD personnel that completed this in 09. And a lot of them were the same people in 20. So I think that's almost unusual, but it was pretty neat as well. So I summarized this briefly to show you there's 10 fields at the Minokan farm, and consequently blue is the carbon levels or the soil organic matter levels for each field in 09. And the orange is what it was in 20. And it's different again now in 23, but this is a good solid block of time. So we'll take this 09 to 20 time. And we're going to look at some samples of why some of these bars are like they are, okay? So if we look at number 2, field 2 is pretty easy to know why this is, because it went into rotational perennials managed grazed during that period of time. So we had an upward movement in carbon. Field 1 is really interesting because in field 1, the orange bar was higher a few years ago. And it was higher when it came out of the managed grazed. And then it went into cropland for about 3 years and lost the carbon, okay? And so it's not that easy to gain, and it's even a little more difficult to hold on to. So it's not an easy scenario because you need to not only sequester it, but you need to maintain it. So let's look at some other fields that are kind of interesting. Field 8 is a corn bean field. So you can see how, on the corn yield, we probably have the corn year a little uptick, on the bean year a downtick. And it pretty much assures you just kind of stay where you are once you've reached a static level. And so a static level is what can be maintained, is the amount of carbon coming in starts to get rather uniform and predictable because it's just a 2-year sequence. So you can kind of see how that happened. And then you look at one like this. This one's kind of interesting because here's a scenario where we had a large gain in carbon, especially in the last number of years. And so what's going on here? And so a lot of what's happening on this particular one is corn for grain, 60-inch corn with cover crops. And then in addition to that, it's also has a planting green history. So whenever we have a low carbon crop like canola or soybean, then they're planted green into a standing rye crop, and that augments and offsets our carbon loss, and you could actually end up with a carbon gain. And so 7, very similar. So you start to see these situations. 3 is interesting because it was in a continuous wheat for about 11 years. It had a slight gain, very slight, but it did have just a little bit of an uptick over time, but very, very slow. So, but this is what we're going to look at, the systems now that kind of make this scenario occur, okay? And so consequently, it's a good to have more than a 1 year's data because when you have about an 11-year run or so here, it gives you a little more concrete information. I think that's a little bit more stable. So, okay. So I had the comment up here on top. It says no-till is not enough, and that's true. And so consequently, we can plant soybean no-till. but the crop, the plant physiology and the plant characteristics are such that it's a lower carbon plant. And so there's not a lot of food in it. And so when the residue comes to the soil surface, it doesn't provide us a lot of cover. And so that's a real critical item for North Dakota going forward. So, and as the Northern Plains going forward, because our bean acres have continued to increase. And so if we're going to grow beans in a somewhat sustainable manner, we have to figure out how to increase our cover. Okay, so the three parts of carbon, of soil organic matter, it's the living portion of the soil organic matter that we first impact. So when we make a change, we add a cover crop or we do something different that moves the carbon dial, this is the area that it starts in. And so the living portion is a lot of times where we're going to see this increase. Also, when we lose carbon, it's where we're probably going to lose carbon first. So we'll probably gain it first or lose it first in this living portion, okay? The goal is to get it to humus. Once we get it to humus, and that's a biological process, but that's more of a time-consuming process. Once we get it to there, we're much more stable. And so a lot of the carbon initiatives going forward, give you an example, voluntary carbon credits talk about long periods of time. And what they're trying to do is have enough time in that system to move it from the living portion to the humus, to the very dead portion. And so then it becomes much more stable. Okay. So soil organic matter, we know this type information. It was set up on an acre. It was set up on 6 inches because that was considered to be a plowing depth back in the day when all of this data was originally put together. And consequently, 1% soil organic matter can weigh approximately 20,000 pounds. Okay. And so I got thinking about that today, and that's not good for an older gentleman like myself, because then you look at stuff like this. You start saying to yourself, well, where did this acre come from? And of course, the acre was the area which could be plowed by one man and one ox in one day. So it was an old English 14th century term. Okay. And the furlong was the distance plowed without rest. So you can see how these things started to play in. And then of course, 660 feet, that became, then it broke down into chains. And then of course, 1 foot was, yes, you guessed it, that was actually the average length of a man's foot. And so all of this started to come together, and then eventually we started spinning off of that for other information like soil organic matter, etc. But so, and of course, there's other options, advantages to increasing your soil organic matter. Your bucket to hold water gets larger. And so you can see for each 1% as you gain, as you go down, you start to improve, or your carrying capacity changes and it expands. And so this is in addition to the nutrient and the water holding capacity in general improves. So it's a win-win, and many times it's difficult to find that. So let's just go briefly through the 4 parts of carbon before we walk into some of these examples. So I like to think of the carbon cycle as 4 parts. And the first 3 parts are in the plant themselves and the plant characteristics. So the grain, 1/3 is in the grain. Now we're just going to take corn for an example. Every grain would be a little different. Okay, every plant would be a little different. But guess what? As a nation, we know a lot about corn, and there's a lot of work done on corn. So consequently, we'll just take that information. 1/3 of that carbon that the corn crop produced is in the grain. And typically it's going to go for food or energy. So it's going to have tires under it and it's going to leave. Okay. And then we've got 1/3 of it in the residue here on the surface. So 1/3 of that carbon's in the residue. And then 1/3 of it is in the root mass. Okay. And so consequently, this first 1/3 we know is most likely going to go down the road. But if we leave the remaining portions intact, most of that will oxidize and go to the atmosphere as CO2, the majority of that, okay? And so really it serves a purpose as armor. Once the plant is dead litter, it's not going to sequester carbon. It's going to give off carbon. And so while the soil will obtain a certain amount of this, maybe 15% of this surface residue, 15% of the 1/3, and the root mass may get as much as 30%, somewhere's in there, the numbers vary, but you understand most of that will go to the atmosphere. So the big impact on carbon is this fourth one. So, and we're getting to that in a second. So we're exporting the grain, we understand that. And many times we're exporting hay. And so same scenario, we lose the carbon, okay? And so the fourth part is the exudates. So that's the sugars coming out of the plant. And so consequently, they can give off a fair bit, 30 to 40% of their fixed carbon as root exudates, so it's significant. And the first 1 to 2 months of a green plant's life. That's why it's so critically important. So a cover crop doesn't have to be in the ground long to give you that benefit. But if you can get 1 to 2 months, 4, 5 weeks, that's significant. And it's not going to be that large biomass, especially in the northern plains in the fall. It isn't, but we can get the exudation. And I think that's really important thing for the fourth part of carbon. This is the one that really, I think when I think back over the last 40 some years, when I started working, we really had little to no knowledge of this part. And it's something that we accumulated over time. So we're going to just jump in now to some examples, things that I've seen move the dial. Okay, this is kind of the easier one for grazers if they have the capability of putting in a full season cover. The plant can fully express itself. You're going to get well past that 4 to 8 week period of exudates. And so you're going to obtain that. And if you can have diversity in it, then I think you're in a great situation. And so this allows us a way to bring livestock back to the landscape. And so here at the Minokan farm, we usually have one of those fields every year. And, it's maybe a 12-way mixture, varies a bit, but all the exudation occurs, and then we get a good trample to the surface. I typically like to clip a few frames and see what my pounds of production is. And we usually use 3% of the body weight, and gives us a good idea of what we're going to harvest out of there and still leave an adequate amount. I like the soil surface to look like this if I have enough material. If I don't have enough material, I got to settle for something else, right? And so, but if I have enough material, I want it to look like this, okay? So sunflowers is another crop that when I looked at the information on which fields move the dials and which ones don't. So sunflower as a cash crop can move a dial when it has an understory of covers. We've seen this happen. We've done it at the Minokan farm in rows where we put the cover crop in between the sunflower rows. They're all seeded at the same time. And the mix we used was about 13 pounds per acre. And I should mention too, anyone that wants a copy of this can just let Trish know. And I'd be happy to send you one rather than if you prefer. So this gives you an idea of what we seeded. It's a small amount of covers, but it has good diversity of covers, and they're all broadleaves. That allowed us a grass herbicide option. And that worked out pretty well for us. Also solid seeded. So it worked out well for us either way. And by the time it's flowering, it looks like any other sunflower crop around, okay? And then of course, the beauty of it is when you harvest, you're ready to graze. The cover's already there. It's already established. It's good, nice, good sized plant. And you got diversity, so you got pretty high plane of nutrition. So that one can move a dial. Rotational perennials. So we do 5-year rotational 5-year runs of rotational perennials, managed grazed. And so this is the mix I used on this last one here. So if you want to build a carbon layer and you want to have a dark carbon layer, you can see in the soils pit here, like to have diversity of plants, okay, because now we're mimicking the native rangeland. And also, if you look, here's kind of an interesting thing. There's a number of forbs in here, okay? The alfalfa, milk vetch, blanket flower, partridge, pea, etc. A number of forbs, they're deep rooted. This alfalfa has a 4-foot taproot exposed to the sunlight, 4 feet down, kept going down the other end of the soil spit right out the bottom, and it stayed green all summer long, even though the entire taproot was exposed, 4 foot. So I found that pretty interesting. So we managed graze this. And what happens at the end of 5 years? Well, here's one of the runs. So from 12 to 17, this was a 5-year period. So organic matter, we started at 2.8. Excuse me, we ended up at 3.5. And one of the other interesting items was we were a bit acidic, and we were at 5.8, and it returned us to neutral on pH. If you're going to return to neutral, your base saturation starts to look different. So all of a sudden your hydrogen ion drops down closer to 0. Okay, you want your hydrogen ion quite low. So if you forgot your base saturation ranges, they're right here. These are kind of the ideal. This is kind of what you would have with neutral pH, okay? And so did it move the dial? Yeah, it moved the dial. It did a few other things. It also moved pH back to neutral. That's a much stronger cropping environment when pH is in a neutral area as well. So it moved. So also with that, you can't forget your basics on grassland harvest. If you remove more than 50% of the leaf by volume, you are going to impact the root mass. If you stay at 50% or less, you're going to have very little root growth stoppage, okay? This is old data, but it's as solid today as it was 50 years ago. And it's good information. So, because keep in mind, if you don't have leaf area, you don't harvest sunlight, you don't harvest CO2 in the stomata. And so you can't take those away and expect to accumulate any carbon. 60-inch corn and covers. This is one that is definitely making an impact as well. So this is 2022 at the Minokan farm. This is a kind of a low carbon mix, okay? It's a little lower than I normally use in terms of the carbon amounts in these plants. These are kind of all lower carbon plants. The reason I went with the lower carbon plants is because the corn is already a high carbon, okay? And you got a number of legumes in here as well. So we got a few legumes in here, and later in the year, I do expect them to start feeding the corn. So they've got some work to do. They're also pollinators. You can see the flax, etc., took off in here fairly well. So consequently, next year in 23, we'll do some changes again on the cover crop mixtures. This one's a lower carbon. In 21, most of you remember 21, we were in this extreme drought. It was a little dry. This is the 60-inch corn in 21. I was pleased with it. You're looking at the covers coming. These covers, from the time they were seeded till the time they evolved, they had no rain on. And so in this ecosystem, because you're creating a different ecosystem, inside these corn rows, 60 inches apart, it's like a little microclimate in there. So when we had crops, covers, and cows event, really, it was a hot day. And when we got into this field, it felt like air conditioning. And it was just cooler. So from a nutrient management, it's a different scenario. It's we try to work with microbes plus carbon plus nutrient plus covers. And so it's a team going to work in there. Then we use plant sap. This might be too small for you to see, but I'll point out a couple items. So We did plant sap 4 times at the Minokan farm on the cornfields last summer. And so with this process that we're using with the microbes and the carbon and the nutrient and the covers, this is the last plant sap we did, and it's dated 8/16. So on 8/16, you can see it's low, optimal, and high across the top here. Okay, so here's your nitrogen right here. We're just coming into optimal, okay? And then if you want to look at phosphorus levels are right here, okay? So they're pretty much in optimal. So it kind of gives you an idea. Potassium is just under optimal. And so since it's every 2 weeks, we can do a little bit of spoon foliar feeding if we need it. And if we don't need it, we don't have to do it. But it tells you ahead of time, which is kind of nice, because then you kind of know the scenario you're looking at. Because if you're going to use any excessive N, it's really hard to sequester carbon. And so if this is a bit moderate and it's a friendly form, this particular scenario, we used fish emulsion and as a foliar with the microbes. And so that was a nice combination. Then 2, if you're unsure, this is a total mineral test right here on the left. And total mineral is, what do I have? What do I got? Okay. So I did this 1 time on each field. Maybe never do it again. I mean, it's a total mineral. So it kind of gives you an idea. That way, you know, if you are inherently short on something, you would know it. Okay. And then this one on the right is the biology. So this is the workers. So I need to kind of keep an eye on them occasionally. So it's the mineral test is, what do I have? The PLFA test is the workers. And really the plant sap is, how am I doing? So you kind of take a look at some tools if you choose to. Okay, so in 21, the really dry year, so we weigh these yearlings after every forage change. So in the 60-inch corn and covers, the average daily gain was 2.8 pounds per day. So that was the highest, as I recall, in 20 or 21 or 22. I think the highest was corn and covers. So out of all the critters in there, the poorest one put on 1.3 pounds a day. The best one put on 3.9. Since you weigh them individually, you know all this information, okay? And it really changes your thoughts. These are open heifers. And it starts to change your thoughts on heifer selection even, because now you got a little information about how well they fit your environment, okay? So I clipped all the covers. So in these fields with 60-inch, 20% of the area had no plant on it, okay? So that's the area in between the corn plant and the start of the cover crop. 50% of it had cover crop planted on it. So 50% of the entire field had cover crop, and 30% of the entire field has the corn crop on it, okay? So that was our drought year in 21. It still produced 40 bushels per acre. and so that to me spoke volumes. And so consequently, you know, it's a pretty strong finisher in that regard. So then planting green is probably something that North Dakota needs to get more serious about. This is June 18th. Okay, this is the Minokan farm. So this field right here on the left is soybean. Okay, planted green, cover's been terminated. This field on the right was planted to soybean also, but it wasn't planted green. Okay. So this lasted better part of 3 days, and it was really hard to see the interstate from here, and consequently it was such a startling change. The field on the right is this one after the wind quit, and so you can see where it had some severe wind damage and shearing as well. So none of these plants are evil. But we have, if we're going to continue to grow soybean for its oil the plant characteristics, being a plant that doesn't produce a lot of cover, and it's low carbon, meaning it decomposes quickly, we have to put ourselves in a position to address this. So this is cereal rye coming up. This is going to go to beans, okay? This is what it looks like. This was April 19th on this given year. So April 19th, you can see if you're going to graze cereal rye, you got to get in there rather early. And so consequently, you're going to do some nipping on it. And we were starting to eye it up. We hadn't been out there yet, but we're starting to eye it up because you get behind it right away. And so it's one of those deals where when it takes off, you don't have enough livestock. And then, you know, there's other times of the year you got too many. And so this is one where you probably don't have enough. So you can kind of give you an idea. We grazed this particular year, we grazed it 14 days. Okay. And 14 days was a nice amount of time. And, you know, you're timing out the seeding of the beans. And so you're trying to work this out in the best manner. And then you're going to put them in. And so consequently, easiest seeding that we do is seeding green because it closes so easy. Okay. It's live. And when it's live, it's just a different working environment. So this is what it looks like. Then it's stable, no wind erosion. We like that. Now we've reduced our evaporation. And so you manage it in terms of the water quantity. What do you got? What are you holding for water? If it's a drier year, you terminate earlier. And if it's a wetter year, you can wait a little bit longer. So let's just touch into the pounds of beef per acre and the pounds of gain per head. So we have a scale, and most years they get weighed 6, 7, maybe 8 times at the most. And after they go through the scale, they get a little sweet cake, and they get pretty agreeable. They're kind of like me. If you feed me well, I'm pretty easy to deal with. And so they go through here as a little bit of a bud box configuration, and we tried to bring them in without any hooting and hollering. It's a pretty low stress and pretty calm delivery. And so let's just look here in 20. So I'm going to point out a few things. So in 20, this blue one is the cereal rye in the spring. So we took 100 pounds an acre of beef off the cereal rye before it went to soybean. Okay. And left adequate cover. All right. We're just taking the tops of the plants. All right. So this one is pasture. So this was about just a little over 100 pounds of beef per acre. And that was the first time through. That's what, F10. Okay. So the orange was the first time through. The blue was the second time through. Okay. So it had rest and recovery in between. And we had a little higher gain the second go around. The plants were maybe just a little bit drier, maybe not quite as much water in them. Would be one theory. Also, the yearlings are more adapted. They've been there a little while now. They've gained some weight. So all these things come into play. But orange and blue are the same field, but 2 times through. All right. And then the gray one is we had a wheat clover that we did a little grazing on early. And then we had a failed stand here of pea canola. So we put in pea canola. And that field didn't play out for us, so we decided to graze it. It's not a good grazing field. They didn't pay any attention to the peas. They took the canola and they took anything that looked like a grass weed, but they paid absolutely no attention to the pea. Okay. So then we went on. This is a little pasture right to the north of the Minokan Farm buildings. It's got upland area and a little lowland area in it, and they lost weight in it. So I thought I had such a good idea to put them in there and buy a little time. Not a good idea. They didn't all lose weight, but they mostly lost weight. There's a few that gained. Again, you're weighing them separately, so then you know this, right? So then the cover crop. So here we went into a full season cover crop. We took just under 100 pounds off of that. As I recall, that got kind of later in the year. And then this one was the corn. So this was the 60-inch corn with covers and a little over 200 pounds. So that can move a dial. Okay. And then the gain,
Jay,
yes.
was that the cornfield? That was after the corn was harvested, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So then the pounds per day, the yearly average daily gain in pounds per day. Okay. So now you've got 20 some head of open heifers. Okay. So on the rye, they show the strongest gain on the cereal rye, but keep in mind it's the first one. So there's also some compensatory gain in it. So it's not pure gain, all right? Because we have them bought in the sales barn. They're nothing special or fancy. We don't know how they were raised or where they come from. So they're just bought by a buyer, and they bring them out and we start the process. But they did really well on the acclimation on the rye. But again, part of that is compensatory gain coming off of their move. So then again, they did quite well in the pastures. Okay, so the rotational pastures, that's this blue one and this orange one. They did well on that, a little over 2 pounds. Second time through, around 2.5. You can see here on that wheat clover, they didn't do real well. They dropped. And the pea canola, not a good idea for us probably to even have grazed it. We'd have been better off not grazing it. It just seemed like the thing to do, but after you see the data, you go, man, maybe not. And then, you start to see, well, here they were losing 1.5 pounds a day average in that wetland area. And there's no water in this wetland, okay? But it's got hydrophytic plants, and it's got some upland area, and it's got ample vegetation. There's a lot of material in it, but it's not going to put pounds on them, I can see. We've done this 2-3 times, and it's always been the same result. So, okay, then this last one was cover crop. So when they were on a full season cover crop, they were gaining, maybe 2.2 or somewhere in there. Average for the year, 2 pounds. They averaged 2 pounds for the year, okay, through all of the changes and the moves, etc. Okay. So then too, the yearling in 21, now looking at 21, you remember 21, that's our big dry year, right? And so now all of a sudden we went from 100 pounds on the rye to maybe less than 30, okay? Because there's just not that much material. So we went a lot lighter on it. Interestingly enough, that really dry year, they had a little gain in the wetland, interestingly. And then you start to look at the perennials. So we went one time through because we had no regrowth. Okay. And again, at the end of the day, here we are with 60-inch corn with covers, still producing a fair bit. You're up there around 130 plus pounds coming off of that, pounds of beef per acre. So the 60-inch with covers was a pretty good contributor, even in a tough drought year. And then the average daily gain in pounds per day during the drought. If you look across the board again, when you get to the end and you do your average daily gain for the year, came in right at 2 again. Okay, completely different set of open heifers, completely different year, but they pretty much average 2 pounds again. So that's all part of the equation, right? If you're going to sequester carbon and try to move carbon in an environment like this, you have to make it work on the yearling end or the cow-calf end or what sheep or whatever you're grazing, okay? So some recommended readings, and then from there we're going to open it up for some conversation. One that I really recommend you read is The Buffalo Harvest by Frank Meyer. And this gentleman is the individual who shot more. He called them buffalo, we would call them bison today, right? But in his title, he called them buffalo. And during that period of time, that 7-year period of time, 6-7 years where most of them were slaughtered, he shot probably more of them than anyone. And he wrote this book, and he tells about his experiences. He also tells it's probably the most factual thing I've read about what these bison actually did. And he described the small herds they were in. He described the matriarch and everything that goes with it. So if you get a chance, that's a really good read. Don't hesitate to read this one. All these books are good, and on the whole carbon scenario, there's lots of scenarios you can do. Our YouTube channel is Minokan Farm. Our website is minokanfarm.com. I just want to give a shameless plug for the Future of Food, which is now on the Minokan Farm homepage. So if you go to our website, there's a 21 or 22 minute video that we put together over the past year plus. And you may find that interesting to watch. There will be a lot of people interviewed on there that you know or know of, or you might have read their book, that type of scenario. So if you get a chance, go ahead and take a look at it. Also, if you're going to have any meetings you're participating in or et cetera, and you want to actually use it and show it, you'd be welcome to that as well. So Trish, with that, I show that was roughly about 40 minutes. So I'm thinking we should have a little bit of time. I think we'll take questions from anyone, probably except Lloyd Elbisher. I don't think we're going to take any questions from him. But again, I really appreciate being invited to visit with you this evening. This is a topic that I have a lot of interest in. And we have a fair bit of data. I mentioned at a board meeting the other day, I said we're data rich and time poor, and because it takes some time to piece it all together. But it's been a really fascinating ride to look at that type data. So with that, I'd be happy to host any conversation.
Yeah, I would encourage you to go ahead and turn your cameras back on if you'd like, and that way we can see one another's faces and ask any questions, like Jay said.
Yeah. The whole carbon scenario, we're going down this big carbon road, right? And as a country, and there's a lot of features to it, and I think it's going to be really fascinating. I looked at the USDA information on climate smart agreements, and it talks about things like multiple measuring tools. And so what does that mean? That can mean a lot of things. Can mean an app on your phone. It can mean a satellite. Everything that we've done here that we looked at this evening is actually taken with the protocol of 15 samples, and it's actually sent into a lab in terms of soil organic matter. Not saying that that's going to be the way of the future, but it's what we've used presently. And I think the whole carbon road is going to get tied in with eventually probably with nutrient density and these type things, but it might be a bit of a process till we get there. Very good.
Chad, do you have a question?
Hi, Jay.
Hi, Chad.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could expound on the difference between, in soil organic matter, the difference between dead and very dead. Because I have a cow that I know is dead here, and I'm wondering when she becomes very dead if she'll be worth more.
I would definitely kind of hang around there and just see how it evolves. Well, as the biology dies, the biology is such a jungle with the large eating the small. It's very much the big guys eating the little guys, and when they each have different CN ratios. And so consequently, this is how we get mineralized nutrient. It's how we go from organic to inorganic plant available nutrient. And so as that occurs and as they die, Okay, so you got the living ones. We recognize that. That's when the cow was still alive yet, Chad. But then as things get eaten and consumed, or they just terminate their life in terms of lifespan. And so all of this starts to get into the dead portion of it, which is significant. And so consequently we get into those phases. Yeah. And so, but I don't think there's much hope for that cow anymore.
Okay. So is that measured? Is there a measurement then on that as far as the quantifying whether it's in that category of dead versus very dead, or is that just terminology?
So when Ann Beclay was speaking at our grazing conference, she touched on this, the neck row, and she touched on that portion of it. I don't, we don't have those type tools. I don't know if your standard lab does. But she touched on that scenario. So I think that would maybe be our source if we wanted to go down that road and ask that question a bit more. From my end of it, Chad, I don't know. I know what she told us that day. So evidently there is some ability to do that.
That video is on their YouTube channel as well. And I'm actually hoping this next week that I'll share several of those from that conference on our Facebook page too. So or go to their YouTube channel and check them out.
I can share that when we send in our leachate from our vermicompost and we send it into the molecular research DNA lab, they can extract all the DNA, but there is no division between live and dead when we receive that. And I don't, so evidently that's maybe an additional step or additional process. But when we get the DNA, it's line by line, fully identified. But there is no separation between live and dead. It's a good question.
That's interesting. Any other questions? I have a question for you. I had written a couple of down, but when you talked about the plant sap test, can you explain that? I'm, of course, a non-farmer, and I've been out of the NRCS office for a few years now. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, if you're going to move a carbon needle, I think there's a much better likelihood of moving it if we use something that's rather plant friendly in terms of a nutrient. So we looked at the leachate as the workers. You can add a carbon source, you can add something as simple as molasses, or you can go to the humic or fulvic acids, which are the end of the decomposition trail. You can add them, in terms of a food source. So you got the workers, and then you add the food, which is the carbon. And then the plant sap tells us if we need to add nutrient. And so if I don't need nutrient, I'm not going to add nutrient. And so what it does is you take the oldest functioning leaf and the youngest functioning leaf on a Monday morning. So we go out there on a Monday morning and I weigh a leaf or two in terms of grams, so I know, because you got X number of grams they want a minimum. Okay, so then you go and you harvest the oldest functioning leaf and the youngest functioning leaf, and you separate them, and consequently you send this in with an ice pack on a Monday morning. We use New Age Lab, and we send it off on a Monday morning, and we gather them on a Monday morning. They want them gathered in the morning. And then we go ahead, and at noon, I'm standing in line at FedEx or UPS or someplace. And then Thursday morning, I'm reading an email. And so, it's not a bad turnaround, and they've been very prompt, I must say. And then it gives us an idea on where things are at. So I'll give you an example. So we had residue to decompose. And so I could actually see the tie up of nutrient in the plant, the lack of nutrient in the plant that was being tied up because your nitrogen went into decomposition. So I had to decompose that first. Okay. So next year going into this, I'll make some adjustments on it at seeding time to account for that. But you can actually see all these scenarios occur in your data over the summer. So we did 4 of them, and we did 2 foliar applications where we put the microbes on, and was a small amount of nutrient. So I got to the end goal. I got a plant in the optimal range on plant sap at the end, but that's not when your yield is determined, right? So the yield's determined much earlier. So now I'm adjusting a little bit for this coming year. So it's a little learning curve to it, but gives you a look at things that you hadn't seen before. Yeah, you read about them and you kind of think it works in this manner. But then when you start looking at a scenario like that, then we had the mineral, that total mineral, and we had PLFA, so I knew how much biology was or wasn't out there. And then you can start to look at this. So the interesting thing, and I haven't put this data together yet, and I haven't really even talked about it because I like to see more than 1 year's worth of information, but I had 4 60-inch cornfields last year with cover crops. Okay, all 4 of them had a bump in carbon at the end of the year. Highly unusual in my monitoring world. When you monitor these fields, and we monitor them twice a year, you monitor these fields, and you have 4 fields planted to a somewhat similar scenario, and each one was 60-inch corn with cover crops. All 4 moved the carbon needle, and I was like, that's interesting. So does it have some potential? Yeah, it probably does. Yeah.
I don't know. I always felt like, when I looked at a lot of soils tests when I was working at the NRCS office, but I always felt like the producers felt like they were kind of like maxed out at like 3.1 or 3.2%,
Well, and they might have been, because what happens with carbon is, it's food. Carbon is food for the biology. And it starts to be, especially if you're repeating a known process,
right?
Okay, or rotation, okay. And so what happens is it starts to plane out, and so they are, in a way, you are maxed out unless you're willing to make a change. And so if you're maxed out, then that process won't stay static horizontal forever either. It starts to taper, even though you are still repeating this known process. From what we've seen over time, it will actually do that as well, because that isn't how nature functioned. Nature functioned with much higher diversity levels, functioned with numerous types of livestock and animal impact, predator-prey relationship, all that. So whatever we can do to start mimicking that a bit, it's an interesting then to watch this reaction occur. And then sometimes we go, oh, wow, look at that. Well, yeah, it's because we're just at a fraction probably of what it was at one time. But if we're going to be in this for the long run, which, my goal is to farm forever. I want to farm forever. That includes ranching, gardening, cropland, it includes it all. And if we're going to do that, then I think we have to put some of these scenarios into place. Probably the biggest one for North Dakota is planting green. Because right now, if we don't get a handle on, our erosion around here is kicked up dramatically. And we have a lot of no-till systems around here. But when we don't have enough cover, no-till is not enough. And we need to be looking at something additional on that. And if we don't start planting green in those environments, erosion and salinity, neither one's going to taper. And they're both going to raise their head and have been.
I see Christoph is on here. Christoph, the
Mr.
rye
Just.
that you had planted, did you, if I remember the video right that you sent me, that was planted green too, right?
Yeah, no, I've on a little bit of a smaller scale, but I've been planting green, particularly soybeans, for, I would say I've tried it 4 or 5 years, and every year I would say it's been a success, other than one year where it was just too dry, and I used up available moisture with the rye. And actually, it was kind of a double whammy because I had flown the rye into standing corn like the previous September. And being in the pothole region that we are, I had, rye that was thicker than the hair on a dog's back over the knolls, and it was drowned out in all the low spots. So where I needed to use moisture, there was no rye. And where I used too much moisture, there was too much rye. So that's one scenario that we can definitely battle. It's on the better drained land, so to speak. That helps on my farm in my area. But I like the system. It's a wonderful feeling to be out there and hear that rye popping like popcorn as the drill or the planters making that pass, and the wind's blowing 50 miles an hour, and you're watching all the dust in the air, and you're sitting out in the field with rye waving in the wind.
And it's always a balance, and Christoph, you, as usual, you bring up a lot of good points, but, it's always a balance. And, I had some on a cornfield, and, I've read all the information about corn going on to rye, and there's people very concerned about it. There's people with no concern about it, people that have done it successfully, etc. Well, I'm not one of the successful ones. And so when our cornfield went on to the rye, and I think a lot of it has to do with termination timing. My corn stand got a little toothy, and so it wasn't a picket fence, and so it wasn't horrible, but it definitely made an impact. And so I like a lot of other covers. I like a little diversity or something. Corn going into winter camelina or something like that might be a better choice. But it's a learning curve. Years ago, Dwayne Beck at Pier told me, he said, Jay, why we till, don't you? And of course, I had a bite and say, well, why would that be, Dwayne? And he said, because that's the maximum nutrient release in the soil. And so he said, when you do that, he said, now you've just kind of hit utopia in terms of the nutrient release. But he said, along with that comes all these other factors. He said, sequestering carbon, salinity, erosion, yada yada yada. And so it's what if we all knew we were going to be leaving for Mars on the spaceship and Earth is going to go away, yeah, we might as well go out there and till it and grow that last crop. And but that isn't the situation. I think we're in here for a long haul, and
we're humans are a species that likes immediate gratification, and
repeatedly.
And I mean, it's one of the reasons why tillage is hard to get away from for a lot of people is, because there is a real response. People joke about recreational tillage and all that, but honestly, there's some pretty intelligent people that are still tilling, and it's because they're getting a response, and it's a longer term commitment, no doubt.
And I think that just sums it up so well. And so we have all these other symptoms, all these other resource concerns, and the whole scenario with wind and water erosion, salinity, and then eventually carbon deficient soils. And so that whole scenario is so fascinating. And I think David Montgomery summed it up so well, in some of the books that he's written in the past, where he's really put that in perspective. And because we're human beings, we have this tendency to revert back to this tillage foundation that was in agriculture for a long time. And so whenever something doesn't go well for a human being, I think they have a tendency to revert back to what worked for them at one time. Whatever. I think that's a little bit in all of us.
One of the things I was thinking about when you were talking about the 60-inch corn with the interseeded covers, I mean, corn is a beast. It can outproduce any other plant in terms of tonnage per acre. But I think, for learning from you guys, the only way to really build organic matter is through the biology, feeding on the root exudates. And I'm just wondering if in a situation of wide row corn with interseeded covers, we might be raising less overall tons of plant material, but we're increasing the amount of root exudates because we have green plants and a diversity of plants and root types through a longer period of the growing season, and it's stimulating the biology. So, it's kind of just that 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 grain stover roots rule.
Yeah.
It kind of doesn't, it's not exactly a fair comparison because it's the diversity, even though there's less biomass there. Really doing what we need to do to feed the biology is how we got to make it happen.
Yeah, and I think when you kind of figure out a way to bring that in, and I think at the end of the day, the bumps that we've seen occur in soil organic matter have come from those increases in plant diversity and come from plants growing during times of year that we normally don't have plants growing, meaning spring and fall. And so those have been the gains. And so then going forward, you also need to have a system that you can maintain, and something, how do you maintain that in the future? And can you keep repeating that known process? But eventually that needs to go to some other crop, for instance. But I think it's kind of part of the process, because I've learned many times, I've had sent samples in at the end of a year, and I'm thinking, wow, this field is not going to play out well. This field didn't go well. And I get the results back, and, carbon didn't look that bad. And I've had the reverse true, thinking, wow, this one should really sing. And it wasn't happy at all. and you took a loss in carbon. And so it can be a bit unpredictable. That's why I like to get a number of years, and like to get a number of sequences. And then, because there's too many variables, it's never going to perform exactly the same way every time. And that's why I was a little surprised with 4 different fields all showing a small carbon bump on the 60-inch. So I grew up on 40-inch corn.
Yeah.
As a kid, and I think I told you this before, Christoph, and with wire check corn, and I'm sure my dad did it that way because it was the hard way. And so we had the 40-inch corn. That was just a joke. And so at the 40-inch corn, it was wide enough to grow something in between, right? So really, we wouldn't even need probably 60. You probably could have something less, or you could go the 2 rows, right? 2 standard rows, and then a wider split, 2 standard rows, wider split. So back in the day when my clan came through Ukraine, they were there for a few generations, and they had the corn rows in place at that time. That was like 4 rows of corn, and then a 4 rows of no corn and 4 rows of corn and something. I don't have that quite right, maybe, but something like that. So it's an old concept, right? I mean, but now we're sticking in some plants in it and letting them do some function there as well. So all of that together is, I'm not set on 60s. I think utopia
Yeah.
would be 40, but then header sizes, see, and all that. So that's the reason. And us at the Minokan farm, we don't have a combine. And so I need to
Mhm.
rely on neighbors, and they've been really gracious and really good about it. And we always have them do their own first, of course. And so then you end up with some weather issues, or maybe winds came through and your cornfield doesn't look quite as pristine as it did when it was ready to combine 2 weeks earlier or 3 weeks earlier, but you work with it. But I think utopia might be something even a little bit smaller. Maybe it's always a balance, right? Agriculture is always a balance.
No, I think you're right. I think 40 inches or somewhere in there could be a pretty good happy medium. 40, 44 inches. Potentially giving up less corn yield, but still allowing
Right.
some sunlight in between the rows to grow some covers.
Exactly.
Right on.
Yep.
How do you and that's the other thing I think people struggle with, is how do you put a value on that? You may not see it in bushels, but
well, there's so many factors. If you walk these fields with the covers, first of all, the pollinators. It's pollinators and insects. Wow. And then wildlife. And then nesting. All of that's in there. And so it's a whole different ecosystem. And so fascinating, because you got this plant diversity, you got some edge effect, right? Because from the whole ecology thing likes to spin off of edge effect.
Mm-hmm.
So you got all of these things happening in there. And we talk about typically one thing, we kind of talk about, quantity, right? In terms of yield, but there's a whole array of additional items. Now, I know those additional items, the year of a banknote being due, they don't pay that banknote, right? So again, it's some balance involved. But you look at that whole scenario, and there is a multitude of wildlife aspects and a multitude of entomology aspects and everything from beetles on. I mean, it's just.
And not only that, but say you give up 10 or 15% of your corn yield, but you can make that up with grazing at the end of the year. So maybe you can be pretty competitive. Honestly, my biggest problem with trying to do it more is crop insurance. And it's not, it's just a huge risk to do something that's not an insurable crop or an approved practice, or I can't, if I have a failure for whatever reason, drought or hail or whatever, and the adjuster comes out and says, well, we can't do anything here because this is not an approved practice. I mean, that'd be a tough one to afford.
So when we first started with cover crops in conversations through USDA with RMA, and when those first conversations occurred, I think it was in 2006, there was no actuary table. Okay.
No. It's everything's worked off of actuaries.
Yep. So the RMA people are sitting around the table with us, and they said, we'd like to support this, and we believe this would be beneficial, but we got to have an actuary. We're required to have this type of information. So that was in 2006, and since then the RMA cover crop scenario has improved, but it's not a lightning quick thing. But it has gotten better over time compared to the start. But I know exactly what you're saying, Christoph. And so you try to balance things to find your way on this thing or find a tool that can move a dial. And,
Mhm.
but those are all for sure, all considerations. And yeah, our RMA lives and dies with the actuary table.
Jay,
I don't want to hog the conversation, or maybe this is a squirrel moment, but I've heard there's always has been and always will be the same amount of carbon on planet Earth. We just, move it around. There's more in the atmosphere than there should be, and more needs to go back in the ground. But just a question, we also hear that root exudates are referred to as liquid sun or
Sugars.
um,
Yeah.
liquid carbon is,
Yeah.
but to me, that means there's kind of a continual transfer of like solar energy to the earth. So how do you interpret that?
That's a deep one.
So I'll give you an example. So, just this might maybe just more compounded than answered, because Christoph already knows there's really not an answer to that. So the other
No, I
day,
thought maybe there is an answer.
well, there might be. We'd have to find it. So in January, I worked a little bit in Kansas, and I'm at Timken, Kansas, and it's a farm there. And so we meet with the farmer, and I had agreed through a third party to do a soil assessment. Okay. And so Kathy and I were on the way to Salina, and on the way to Salina, we stopped at Timken, and we, it's a day's work. And so I start this process, and the farmer had backhoed 3 soil pits and 3 different land uses. Okay. And so we're standing in one of them, and then he invited the neighbors over. So we had a dozen neighbors who came over, and so we're all standing and staring at a soil pit together. And I had my CO2 meter, and it was registering 450 some parts. Okay. And I handed it down to the farmer in the soils pit, and I said, put it in the bottom of the pit. And so he put it in the bottom of the pit. It jumped up 20 points. Okay. And so it was just a good example of, and that pit had been dug the day before. Okay. But it was still emitting CO2. And so much of this, of what you're talking about, you've watched the NASA supercomputer video about life on Earth with CO2. Gives a good example of its cycle. Okay. And so, we fill the atmosphere in the dormant period, and then it gets drawn down during the green period. And then depending on if you're in the northern hemisphere, the southern hemisphere, yada, yada, yada. And then you start looking at that scenario on just how you can, you dig a pit 3-4 feet deep, and how even 24 hours later, it has more CO2 emitting out of it. So you really start to understand that the CO2 that's contained in the earth itself, and through the whole biological process and death of microbes and respiration and all this comes into play. And then you start looking at things like even a mask. So a healthcare worker wearing a mask, and your breath is probably around 30 to 40,000 parts per million. And so you're asking that individual, and the reason I say this, I was in clinic today. So you're asking that individual to breathe their own CO2 for 8 hours. And you're not made for that. Your respiratory system isn't made for that. So you start looking at this whole scenario about how this situation works and how it comes out of the atmosphere and how we need a green plant and how every green plant is this carbon inlet. And so it's never really meant to be in one place that long. It is a cycle. And we're trying to sequester a really small amount of that into our soils. And when we get a really small amount, we see a little bit of a tick on the soil organic matter, but really it's a pretty small amount. And so over time, all of this kind of comes into play because it's such a carbon dominated world. It's just in everything. And so we can go ahead and take a look at it, but I guess I don't have a particular thought in terms of what you just mentioned, Christoph, but it's really complex in terms of where it goes and how it gets there. And you know, everything from this corn production, that third we didn't talk about, that goes to the ethanol plant, the CO2 gets emitted again, right? And so it's always going in agriculture, it's always going to evolve that way. And so it's a really interesting scenario, and wish I could answer you with confidence, but I understand it better in increments myself.
No, that was good. And we don't want to answer everything tonight. We want to leave something
There's not
for
much danger.
another meeting.
Danger.
You're funny.
Well, great questions. But it's these questions that eventually, over time, I've told some people this story before. Back in this was a long time ago. This was probably 25 years ago or more. I gave a presentation and talked about the soil organic matter changes in our cropping systems after we moved into no-till. And so in Burleigh County, we moved in. First one I think went in '93, and then we had a bunch more in the mid '90s. And by the end of the '90s, it was going pretty good. And then over a 12-year period, we averaged because I tracked quite a few of these systems, and I probably tracked pretty close, right around 15 of them. And over time, 12-year period, we gained 1% on the average on these no-till systems. But keep in mind, they went from full tillage to a no-till system. You're going to get this almost like livestock with a compensatory gain. And so I made this as part of my talk, and I had the data. And I get this email, a little bit of an unpleasant email, a couple of days later, from a very prominent, well-known person, explaining to me, doing the math for me, that was mathematically impossible. That you cannot accumulate 1% over this 12-year period. And did the math in terms of the biomass production that it would take to do that. Okay, there was no discussion of exudates, but truthfully, we probably didn't know, right? And so consequently, never after the exudation part came out and we started understanding carbon a little better, I never got a retraction from that person. But initially there was a less than pleasant email about how this is impossible. But
Yeah.
You know, it's just part of the process. And,
Yeah.
Yeah. But now we understand a lot more about carbon and the accumulation of it. And my 1% over 12 years was an unacceptable amount. So, and but in today's world, it's pale in comparison. Yeah. I mean, it's, yeah, you can do it.
Pete,
But-
did you
but
have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering what the gains on those 60-inch corn, what was the gain on that per acre? I think you
So-
showed us.
So on the pounds of beef per acre, Pete?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm trying to recall here, between the dry year and the wet year.
What
One
was the
was
year
like-
when you had 40 bushel?
Okay, that would have been the dry year. That would have been
Yeah.
2.8 was the pounds of gain per critter. Okay, 2.8 pounds. They gain 2.8 pounds per day. And the beef per acre, gosh, it was something under 100, I think, on the dry year, or around 100.
That's
I
what
would
I was
I
thinking.
would have to go back and look.
I
I
was
have
thinking
it.
it was like 200.
I
but
have it
maybe-
on there. The wet year was 200, I think. But the
What was
dry year was less. Maybe the dry year was a little over 100, but I have the slide on there. Yeah. So it's still, even in the dry year, it's still, they did well.
What'd you bushel out at on the wet year?
The wet year, I think we had just under 80, 75 to 80.
And you were
And
at what, 40 on the dry year?
Yep. And I think, so last year with the nutrient scenario, I think we spent just under $15 an acre for nutrient. The thing that I've really observed is when we put it on as a foliar with the plant sap analysis, knowing ahead of time what we need. With the foliar, you're bypassing the microbe, the soil microbe. And so, because the microbes always eat first. And so you're bypassing that scenario. So I feel it's probably a little more efficient if you have the opportunity or the manpower or labor or equipment to do it. The plant sap allows it to take place.
So Christoph was wondering about, or to some extent, the economics on that 60-inch corn. From what I'm kind of figuring, these, granted, these are rough numbers. Your gain on the residue amounts to just about maybe 37%-ish, somewhere around there is the gain you would get as the gain off the corn.
Okay.
So as long as Christoph's corn yield didn't drop by more than 37%, you should see an economic gain from that scenario.
Well, yeah, and I agree. I think it can be a good practice because you're covering so many bases for all the reasons Jay talked about, diversity, and it's just like I say, there's a risk level anytime I think I might be jeopardizing crop insurance. If there's a failure, if it's hailed out or droughted out or winds, we have a yield claim on the corn, but I think it can be competitive economically, and then all the other benefits that go along with it. So I've tried it and it intrigues me. I want to try it more, but I'm held back by that added potential risk.
So I have a question for you about the perennial plantings. Now that you guys have done them for several years, but do you see, like, in your establishment, how long is it taking you to get what you would consider a full establishment on those perennials?
So the first one we did with a combination of cool season and warm season plants. And the second one, we went with cool season plants.
Okay.
Because in a 5-year window in our neck of the woods, it isn't an adequate, you're just starting to get the warms established. Whereas the cools are ready to go the second year.
Okay.
And so we establish them 1 year. Sometimes we've done some really late light grazing on it. Maybe, after a number of frosts, we might do a little bit of grazing on it, but for the most part not. And we did try the worms initially, but I didn't do them the second time. So I expanded the forward list the second time, and then the species that are that were on there tonight were the last ones that we used. And they're good establishers. Obviously you want things that are adapted to your neighborhood and function well, and all of these do for us.
Yeah. That's interesting. Any other questions out there? Chad, I wasn't sure you had unmuted yourself at one point, but
Yeah, I have questions, but it's getting late. We can talk about it another day. But I guess that the one thing I wanted to bring up was, the amount of testing, Jay, that you've done at the Minokan farm, and a lot of it's on cropping. How can we transition, or what? I want to talk to you sometime about what different types of tests or testing we can do on our pasture land in conjunction with this idea of carbon sequestration and things like that, to be able to quantify some of this, and then also be able to start putting it in a user-friendly form that the average producer can use that information for management.
So one thing that is, I haven't looked at this data for a while, but back in the day, if I was working on a farm here in Burley County, I would also take a soil test in the native rangeland. And they varied. So if I was in the glacial outwash sands, they might have been 2.5%. Okay. If I got up into the glaciated areas, more up in the north end of the county, you're probably going to find them 6%, 5s, 6s. I think one of the higher I ever came across was 7. I think was maybe one of the higher. And again, when I would do a protocol on them, I wouldn't take them on the top of the knob, and I wouldn't take them in the bottom of the swale. And so I would go kind of basically in between. I felt that was kind of a good generic area, was a fair representation of the field. And so, sometimes we have these thoughts that our grasslands are really high in carbon, and but they evolved and found some kind of equilibrium over geological time. And so I think consequently it kind of likely depends on how closely we mimic the bison that were here at one time. And Trish and I were talking about, is it Hormé? Is that how you pronounce his last name?
Gus Hormé.
Yeah, Gus Hormé. And so if you get a chance, read a little bit about him, because I kind of liked what he had put together. He's passed away, I think, in 99 or 2000 or something like that. He had worked in Western U.S. grasslands for many years. And so if you want to read about Gus Hormé, there's options in there for what I think of in terms of large scale grasslands that are rough topography, scattered low amounts of water, those type things.
We'd like to thank Jay for joining us this evening.